Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, thousands of people die on migration routes every year, many of them across Africa and of African nationality. In an historic call to action, a dozen international organisations urge countries to do more to support the thousands of vulnerable people who head out on the road every year in search of a better life. Also, the war in Ukraine seen global oil prices soar, boosting the revenue of many petrol-producing nations. But in Nigeria, though it's Africa's biggest oil producer, people still find it tough to get their hands on fuel. And in Senegal, oyster farmers are already racing against time to preserve their way of life, as around 40% of the mangroves they rely on have already disappeared due to climate change. But first, since 2014, an estimated 18,000 African nationals have died whilst travelling often uncertain and dangerous migration routes. The problem is a global one. Over the last 4 years alone, overall, more than 15,000 migrants have died. Thousands have gone missing, and those numbers are likely an underestimation of the scale of the problem. Those on the move may be fleeing poverty, oppression, violence, or they may just be seeking a better life for themselves. But whatever the reason they set out, they're often vulnerable and unsupported, sometimes fatally so. A dozen international organisations and agencies have come together to push for more responsibility from states in tracking and protecting migrants. Jorge Galido from the UN's International Organisation for Migration joins me now. Jorge, thanks very much for speaking to me. Now, first of all, give us a sense of how Africa and Africans are affected by some of the dangers of migrations that have been highlighted in this call on Monday.
Thank you very much, Georgia. Well, I think it's important to highlight the fact that as migration policies have become ever more restrictive, as safe and regular migration pathways remain out of reach for so many people, including in the context of COVID-19, of course, many people continue to seek better lives, better opportunities, dignity, to flee persecution in increasingly riskier ways. And what we're trying to highlight here is that states have a responsibility to look look at their policies and to see how we can prevent further loss of life going forward.
And when it comes to Africa, are there specific routes or specific profiles that are of concern to you?
Yeah, what's important to highlight, and as you mentioned earlier, there are over 18,000 African nationals that have died during migration worldwide since 2014. Important to highlight that this is most likely an undercount, and there are, this is particularly true in especially remote migration routes, whether it's the Sahara Desert or whether it's en route to the Canary Islands or whether it is along the Horn of Africa en route to Yemen. What we're seeing is, again, that African migrants and migrants worldwide, this is a global issue, but affecting also Africans, they're turning to unscrupulous smugglers. They're falling prey to human trafficking, who themselves, use riskier methods, whether it's on a dinghy at sea or other unsafe transportation on the desert.
Now, the war in Ukraine turned a lot of attention to the dangers faced by those heading out on the road and the trauma that kind of effect that they can face because of that. Now, obviously, in that scenario, it is a war that's created an outflow of refugees rather than migrants. Nevertheless, is there a crossover in terms of some of the problems we've seen on that side and some of the concerns that have been highlighted by the IOM?
Well, one thing that we've seen, unfortunately, is that already over the last few days, there has been records of people dying when trying to flee the country. And, the situation, of course, pertains to all people in the country who are trying to flee. And the International Organization for Migration is making a strong call to ensure the safety of everyone, regardless of their migration status, of their ethnic background, of the color of their skin. Those who are trying to flee the country, they should be able to do so, and they should have access to safety and access to shelter. We're talking about over 100,000 third country nationals who have already left Ukraine, arrived into neighboring countries. And again, we're hoping that this call to action at a time when countries will get together to review their progress made on the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly Migration will again prompt action from the governments to deal with this issue.
And Jorge, very quickly, give me a bit of a sense of what this call to action actually consists of.
Well, there's basically three parts to this. I think on the main, it's about preventing further loss of life. I think this is done by prioritizing search and rescue operations, by ending the criminalization of NGO actors providing life-saving assistance. It's also, of course, very important to not forget the families left behind, the families of missing migrants who need support to seek information about their loved ones, to be informed about their status of their requests for information, to know what happened to the migrants gone missing. And of course, very important for them to be able to have a dignified recovery and repatriation of their families.
Jorge Galindo there. Thank you so much for speaking to me about that call to action to states to offer more support to migrants, thousands of whom die every year on migrational routes. Quick look at some news in brief. Nigeria says it will not allow its nationals to fight Russian forces in Ukraine. About 15 Nigerians approached the Ukrainian embassy, indicating their willingness to join the war in Eastern Europe after a call for support by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky last week. The Foreign Affairs Ministry of Nigeria says it's in talk with its Ukrainian counterparts to prevent Nigerians being recruited as what it's calling mercenaries. France says that its militaries killed a senior leader of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb in Mali. Yahya Jaoudi is an Algerian, also known as Abu Amma al-Jazeera. He was reportedly killed by ground forces in late February in the center of the country. A falling out with the military junta of Mali sees France preparing to pull out about 2,400 troops it has in the country as part of an anti-terror operation. On Monday, the country's army said that at least 2 soldiers and 2 UN peacekeepers were killed in separatist attacks. And Moderna's signed a deal for plans for its first mRNA vaccine manufacturing facility in Africa. A memorandum of understanding was settled with Kenya with the goal of producing up to 500 million doses of vaccines a year for the continent. The pandemic highlighted the huge shortfall in Africa's vaccine manufacturing capacity. Now, the war in Ukraine's seen global oil and gas prices soar and boost the revenue for petrol-producing nations. But though Nigeria is Africa's biggest oil producer, fuel is still frustratingly hard to come by. Laurent Berstecker tells us more.
At this gas station in Lagos, traffic has come to a grinding halt. These drivers say they've been waiting since the early morning for a chance to fill up their tanks.
The hours that you're supposed to work, you use it in the filling station to quick for fuel. After getting to fuel, you spend all the hours in traffic.
Since early February, Africa's biggest oil producer has been facing a deepening fuel crisis. Despite having some of the world's largest reserves of crude oil, Nigeria has little refining capacity and must import a majority of its fuel. Authorities have also invested billions of dollars into an expensive fuel subsidy scheme dating back to the 1970s, a policy intended to help lower the price of gas, but which places a high financial burden on the government and has left Nigeria vulnerable to shortages. Over the past month, gas prices have more than doubled on the black market, severely impacting livelihoods in a country where fuel is the main source of energy.
I'm stranded here because I'm not mobile. We are not allowed to buy fuel. I'm not doing black market with the fuel. I just needed the fuel for my generator so that I can preserve my food in my freezer.
The latest crisis was blamed on a batch of contaminated fuel which was recalled from the market last month, sparking widespread shortages. Nigeria's National Petroleum Corporation said last week it was working on measures to restore normal supply as quickly as possible.
Now, the latest report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, released in late February, delivered a stark warning about the impacts of climate change. It said that half of the world's people are highly vulnerable to serious destructive changes. Lives and livelihoods are at risk. In Senegal, oyster farmers are already racing against time to preserve their way of life, as an estimated 40% of the mangroves that they've always relied on have already disappeared.
On a small island in the heart of the mangrove, villagers are setting up oyster nets. These cultivators will gather the larvae known as the spat that circulate in abundance in the brackish water. Oyster cultivation is hard but more lucrative than traditional farming.
When we collect the oysters, we sell them at the market. The money collected allows me to help my husband with his daily expenses and also to buy school supplies for my children. This project is really very beneficial for us women.
Over the last 3 years, around 200 female oyster breeders in this region have been trained by the International Fund for Agricultural Development. They've learned techniques that avoid harming the mangrove. Traditionally, tree roots are cut during the collection of wild oysters.
We prevent people from entering the mangrove to cut it down by putting up barriers. So these enclosures serve to close off access to the roots while offering an alternative. Secondly, do you see the poles we use? This is eucalyptus. It's part of the conservation process.
In the Sine Saloum, most communities rely on the mangrove for their livelihoods in one way or another. But overexploitation, the decrease in rainfall and the rise in sea level are putting the wetlands at risk. Replanting is essential to preserve them. Here, the village women are doing just that on 5 hectares. The stakes are high.
As soon as you remove these buffers, the water will go directly to the mainland and salinate the agricultural land. It will increase poverty and hunger.
According to a UN report, mangroves are being destroyed up to 5 times faster than traditional forests. In the Saloum Delta and south of the country in the large Casamance Delta, efforts are underway to protect this extremely fragile ecosystem.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.
Hello, I'm Annette Young, the host of 51%. As war continues in Ukraine in a special edition, we're focusing this week on its impact on women. With hundreds of thousands fleeing the conflict, it's also putting women and girls at heightened risk of violence. We'll be talking to those who stayed behind, some joining the fight itself, and those from afar who are now watching in horror as their country transforms into a battlefield.
The 51%, presented by Annette Young on France 24 and France24.com.